I grew up in probably your standard household, two parents, both with master's degrees. We moved around a little bit when I was a kid. My parents were both educators, and my dad was really chasing a career, so we moved a little bit. And I always had the sense of I didn't fit in. I was sort of awkward and didn't do well with my peer group necessarily. And so I never really feel like I had a place or a community. When I was in high school, I felt that I was called to be a nurse. So when I graduated high school, I went to nursing school and had a really great nursing career. I moved away from Texas up to Boston and was doing some nursing consulting work, fell down some stairs, and had a back injury and a broken tailbone. So I went to the emergency room, and I was immediately prescribed opioids and Xanax to help with pain. And to this day, I'm not really sure why they gave me Xanax, but I took it. But what the experts didn't know was that there's a history of addiction in my family. There is a history of mental health issues in my family. And now we know that there is correlation between people who have addiction and family history and mental health issues. So as much as the doctors did prescribe it and continued to prescribe it for years, they can't be solely responsible because we didn't have all the information that we needed at the time this happened. And also, we can't expect every physician prescribing any type of medication, but especially a controlled substance, to be able to have the time to say, tell me about your family. Is there a history of addiction? And is there a history of mental health issues? I mean, I wish that we had a health system in the United States that did that, but that's not what we currently have. And that's not what we had when I became addicted almost 20 years ago. I still have friends in the medical community, and I was in the medical community. So I see both sides, especially now, because I have now some personal perspective and some professional perspective, and now, an expert's perspective on prevention. But with the medical knowledge I have now, I realize that there are a lot of solutions that we could offer to the medical community, but they're not yet at a place to really embrace the solutions. And we're all resistant to change. Change is hard, but it's necessary. Change at the level we're talking about, systemic change, is incredibly hard to do. It's incredibly expensive, and it takes a lot of voices to get us there. And it's not just the medical community. It's not just your physicians and nurses and pharmacists. It's your pharmaceutical companies. It's your lobbyists. It's your congressmen and, it's insurance companies. We need systemic change. The best way I can explain what happened before, opioids and what happened after, and maybe I don't know that it was something that happened to me that I could have changed, but I can tell you that by the third or the fourth day of me using opioids to treat physical pain was that I felt like a light switch had gone on. And all of a sudden I was seeing the world in different colors. I was not as socially awkward. I felt more comfortable with myself. And I moved from treating physical pain to treating emotional pain. But the best way I can explain that to someone who maybe has never used drugs or never had my experience it was like a light switch. And every time I took a pill, I liked the light coming on. And I can tell you, I know the room I was in, the address I was in when I felt that phenomenon for the very first time. It is now a core memory. That first light switch was pretty cool. And the ones that followed for a little while still felt pretty good. But at some point, I did definitely develop a tolerance to the medication itself, which is physical tolerance, not an emotional tolerance, although that does come into play. But I was also experiencing withdrawal symptoms when I would stop taking opioids. And no one ever had, and even though I was a nurse and could have done my own research on opioids, no one ever had a conversation with me about, you really need to be cautious when you're taking these medications, and this is why. And if you stop taking them abruptly, this is what you're going to experience. And this was at the height of the fentanyl or the opioid crisis in Massachusetts, which was super fascinating to me because the doctors were prescribing, but it was the pharmacists who had recently, the state had recently mandated a prescription drug monitoring program, or a PDMP. So the doctors were writing the prescriptions as fast as they could, and I was going to as many doctors as I could to get those prescriptions. But it was only the pharmacist saying, I see you got this filled 4 days ago by another doctor. Why are you coming to me now? Which is fascinating to me to look back and to know that at the time, the East Coast was experiencing some of the worst years of their opioid crisis. The physicians were not part of the solution. Only the person dispensing the actual drug. So the pharmacist caught on. So I had more trouble filling the prescriptions. What does someone do when they can't get their opioids from a medical professional? They find other ways. So I found other ways and started buying off the street. So I purchased at the pharmacy and was also, buying on the street. But I did that for probably a year. And then my sister-in-law at the time died of a drug overdose. Of course, now we don't know what, they didn't do a lot of testing. It was just labeled a drug overdose. So we're not even sure what the drug was. So I don't know if it was a poisoning of fentanyl or of something else. But I realized that I didn't want to have that happen to me and to my family, but I also didn't know how to do anything differently than I'd been doing for several years at that point. A lot of that recognition came from just the amount of pills I was consuming a day. Because not only did I have, withdrawals when I stopped using, but the physical tolerance just got more and more extreme. And I still have that tolerance to this day. Haven't taken, a non-prescribed opioid, I'll say, in over 13 years. But the physical tolerance really became a problem. And at the end of my active addiction, I was taking upwards of 100 pills a day because I would take so many opioids, that they would make me itch. So I would take Benadryl, and the Benadryl, had a side effect, so I would take another pill. And all of this made me edgy, so I would take another pill. So, yeah. I was living in Texas again, and I didn't have any pills. And I couldn't get them as easily here as I was able to in Massachusetts. I didn't have maybe the connections that I needed, or wasn't in the right neighborhood. I'm not really sure, but I couldn't buy off the streets anymore. I just didn't know who to go to and who to ask. So I was really a lot more dependent on, getting it from physicians. And Texas didn't have a prescription drug monitoring program at the time. So the pharmacists weren't wise. The physicians weren't aware. So for a long time, I doctor shopped. And the pharmacists couldn't tell where I was getting any prescription. So I would just go to different pharmacies each day or, every week or so. But at some point, the doctors started suspecting that I might have a addiction problem, but they wouldn't have that conversation with me. They would just say, I'm sorry, I can't prescribe. So there was no conversation of, you may need to let us help you. There was no conversation of, you could harm yourself, what you could do as an alternative or how they could help. I was just cut off. And so I called in a prescription to the pharmacy myself, and I got arrested at the pharmacy. So I was arrested at the pharmacy. My family at the time, I don't think, had any clue as to how extreme my problem was. I know now that they were suspecting, my mom especially was suspecting that there was, some misuse going on, but I don't think she had any, comprehension of how bad the problem was until she got a phone call from the police. So I was arrested, and the condition of me getting out of jail was that I would go to treatment. So within 4 or 5 days, I was in a 28-day residential treatment center, and I had the privilege to do that because my family was able to pay the cash to get me into treatment. A lot of people don't have that privilege. So for the first 16 days, I was only there because that's what my family wanted me to do. And then day 17, my head was really starting to clear. I had gotten a lot of the drugs out of my system, and I was really able to evaluate the situation, a little more objectively and see that I had a lot of consequences and it was going to take a lot of work to overcome them. And some I probably would never overcome. And so day 17 through 28, I probably got the most use out of the cash that was paid. Getting arrested was the best thing that's happened to me, which you don't hear a lot. I get it. I work with law enforcement, and every time someone hears me say that for the first time, we have to have a conversation about it. It was quite a few years before I even considered working in the addiction field or the prevention world. My first job out of treatment and after a few months of stabilization was at Starbucks because they didn't do a background check. So at the time, I didn't want to go back to nursing, and I still don't. That doesn't mean that I can't affect change. I can still use my knowledge, but I just didn't think that I wanted to go back. So I worked at Starbucks for 3 or 4 years. Had another back injury, actually the same back injury that kind of reared its ugly head and had to have surgery. So that was interesting, having surgery, after, heavily misusing opioids was a difficult process. But it was when I moved from the Dallas area to San Antonio. And I got connected with a 12-step group here, which I'm no longer in the 12-step fellowship, but I think that can be beneficial. But someone in that group said, you should work you would be really great, like at a treatment center or something. So my first job in this field was at Alpha Home, which is a residential treatment center here in San Antonio. And I realized in the year that I was at Alpha Home, which probably was my hardest job, was that I wasn't cut out for treatment, to work in treatment, but I was cut out to fit in this, in this world, in, this profession. So I started looking around at other companies and, nonprofits. And at that point, we were starting to hear more about peer recovery coaches or, recovery support specialists. And it sounded pretty interesting to me that I would be able to use my lived experience to help others. And who better to get guidance from than someone who's experienced what you're going through? So I applied for a job at Cicada and worked as a recovery coach in the recovery and adult services department for a year. But the work that I was doing was some in the community, going out and meeting partners and doing training with professionals to talk about language we use, to educate people about why we say substance use disorders and why that's important and what does the data say. So I really liked the community work. And I really liked then, it was policy change. I wasn't able to articulate that at the time. But Cicada has coalitions that work mostly in policy. How do you change a business policy to make things safer? How do you change a bar's policy to make things safer? How do you change city, county, state, or federal policy? So I really thought that was something that I would be good at doing. And so there was an opening in the coalition department, and I interviewed and moved to departments, and that's been 5 years. The recovery? I wouldn't say that. Not now. I would say that the first 1 to 2 years were hard because I was essentially rebuilding an identity and rebuilding a future that was a healthy one. So it was hard because there have to be a lot of changes with friend groups, with communities, with thought process, and that is all hard to do. So yes, the first 1 to 2 years was hard, but it'll be 14 years in January, and I really am not at a place where I count days anymore. I haven't counted days in a long, long time. But now, with 13, almost 14 years of perspective, it's not hard at all. It's pretty cool. I get to have relationships with my families that are meaningful. I have the privilege of, one of my oldest nieces, coming to visit today, or my oldest niece coming to visit today. I have the privilege of, taking my youngest niece to the museum that she loves. I get to I get to care for my aging parents. And I would not have had that without recovery.